Chapter 1. The Invitation to Isolation. The envelope arrived on a crisp November morning, delivered by the postman who always lingered a little longer at Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead. It was heavy cream paper, sealed with real wax, and addressed in a spidery hand that she recognized at once. Lady Evelyn Hargrove, someone she had known distantly in the years after the war, when Evelyn had been a bright young thing and Miss Marple a quiet visitor at charity functions. They had not corresponded in decades. Inside was a brief, elegant note. "My dear Jane, I am giving a small house party at Snowstorm Manor over Christmas and into the New Year. The company will be select, the air bracing, and the solitude complete. I find myself longing for sensible conversation amid all this modern noise. Do say you will come. The train from London stops almost at the door. Ever yours, Evelyn Hargrove." Miss Marple turned the card over in her hands, noting the faint scent of lavender water and the slight tremor in the handwriting. Age, perhaps, or something else. She had no particular plans for Christmas, and the idea of a quiet country house with good fires and, one hoped, tolerable food was appealing. She wrote her acceptance that same afternoon. 3 weeks later, on a bitterly cold afternoon in late December, Miss Marple boarded the train at Paddington. She travelled light. One modest suitcase, her knitting bag, and a small basket containing homemade scones for the journey. The carriage was almost empty. Snow had begun to fall in soft, persistent flakes. As the train steamed northward, past frost-laced fields and hedgerows heavy with white. At dusk, the train slowed and halted at a tiny wayside station marked only by a weathered sign. "Hargrove, halt." A single motor car waited on the narrow road beyond the platform. An elderly Daimler driven by a uniformed chauffeur whose face was half hidden by a scarf. He touched his cap and took her back without a word. The drive climbed steeply through dark woods. Snowstorm Manor appeared suddenly at the crest of the hill, a sprawling Victorian Gothic pile of turrets and chimneys, its windows glowing amber against the whitening landscape. It looked, Miss Marple thought, exactly like the setting for one of those sensational novels young people read nowadays, remote, romantic, and just a little forbidding. The great oak door opened as the car crunched to a stop. Lady Evelyn herself stood in the doorway. Thinner than Miss Marple remembered, wrapped in a velvet housecoat the colour of burgundy wine. "Jane, my dear, how wonderful you've come." Her voice was warm, but her eyes flicked anxiously toward the sky, where snow was falling thicker than ever. "We're in for a real storm, they say. Come in, let's get you warm." The entrance hall was vast and dimly lit, with a roaring log fire in an ingle nook large enough to roast an ox. Suits of armour stood like silent sentinels along the panelled walls, and a sweeping staircase curved upward into shadow. The air smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and something faintly medicinal. Other guests were already gathered around the fire, and Lady Evelyn performed introductions with practised grace. First was Captain Richard Ricky Hargrove, her nephew and heir to the estate, a tall, handsome man in his late 30s, with restless eyes and a clipped military moustache. He greeted Miss Marple politely, but with a hint of impatience, as though he had been interrupted in some private calculation. Next came Diana Lyle, a striking actress of about 30, whose platinum blonde hair and scarlet lipstick seemed almost too vivid against the sombre surroundings. She wore a long emerald green dress that clung to her figure and laughed a little too loudly at nothing in particular. Dr. Marcus Fenton was a thin, bespectacled man in his 50s, with a soft voice and nervous hands. He had, Lady Evelyn explained vaguely, been the family physician for many years, and was staying to keep an eye on things. He nodded to Miss Marple, but said little, his gaze drifting frequently to the windows, where snow now lashed against the panes. Then there was Mrs. Amelia Bantry, no relation to Miss Marple's dear friend Dolly, an ample, flustered widow in rustling black silk, who talked incessantly about her late husband's investments and her delicate health. She clutched a small dog, a peak named Precious, who yapped at everyone indiscriminately. Finally, Mr. Julian Carver, a sleek young solicitor from London with slick dark hair and a pinstripe suit that seemed out of place in the country. He smiled smoothly and complimented Miss Marple on her journey, but she noticed that his eyes were sharp and assessing, like a man perpetually adding columns of figures. Servants hovered in the background. Mrs. Grayson, the housekeeper, a tall, gaunt woman with iron-grey hair. Bates, the butler. Elderly and stooped, and two silent maids who moved like shadows. Tea was served in the drawing-room. Delicate sandwiches, scones with damson jam, and a rich fruit-cake. Conversation was polite but strained. Captain Hargrove spoke of the difficulties of maintaining the estate in these hard times. Diana Lyle recounted amusing anecdotes from her latest West End triumph. Dr. Fenton murmured about the weather forecast, which promised the worst blizzard in 20 years. Outside, the wind began to howl in earnest. After tea, Lady Evelyn showed Miss Marple to her room, a large chamber on the second floor with a four-poster bed, heavy brocade curtains, and a fire already laid. From the window, she could see nothing but swirling white. The woods and hills had vanished. As she unpacked her few things, Miss Marple's ears caught fragments of raised voices from the corridor below. Captain Hargrove and Mr. Carver, arguing about money, something to do with the trust, and her ladyship's new will. The words were quickly hushed. Dinner was announced at 8. The dining room was panelled in dark oak, lit by candles in silver candelabra that flickered whenever the wind rattled the windows. The table was beautifully set, but the atmosphere was oddly tense. Diana Lyle drank rather too much claret and laughed at her own jokes. Mrs. Bantry complained that the soup was too salty. Dr. Fenton kept glancing at Lady Evelyn, who seemed pale and distracted. During the fish course, the lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Bates murmured something about the generator struggling in the storm. By the time coffee was served in the library, the snow had become a solid wall of white beyond the French windows. The telephone line, Lady Evelyn announced quietly, had gone dead an hour ago. The roads would certainly be impassable by morning. "We are quite cut off," she said, attempting a smile. "But we have plenty of food, oil for the lamps and logs for the fires. We shall be cosy enough." No one contradicted her, but Miss Marple noticed how Captain Hargrove's jaw tightened, how Diana Lyle's manicured fingers drummed on her glass, how Dr. Fenton's eyes darted toward the door as though expecting someone who would never arrive. Later, in her room, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting. The house creaked and groaned around her like an old ship in heavy seas. She thought of the people downstairs, each with their private burdens, their guarded glances, their careful silences. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that human nature was much the same everywhere. The same passions, the same weaknesses, the same capacity for deception. A grand manor house and a blizzard might change the scenery, but people remained people. She clicked her needles steadily, counting stitches, already storing away small observations. the way Lady Evelyn's hand had trembled when pouring coffee. The faint bruise on Diana Lyle's wrist that powder could not quite conceal. The mud on Captain Hargrove's shoes, though he claimed not to have been outdoors all day. Outside the storm raged on, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside Snowstorm Manor, 8 people and one quiet old lady from a village were sealed together until the snow should stop. Miss Marple finished her row, snipped the wool, and went to bed. She slept lightly, as always, listening to the wind. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Whiteout. Miss Marple woke to a world of absolute silence. No bird song, no distant church bell from the village, no rumble of carts on the lane. Only the muffled hush that comes when snow has fallen thick and deep through the night. She drew back the heavy curtain and saw that the storm had transformed everything. The grounds of Snowstorm Manor lay buried under drifts higher than a man's waist. The trees were bowed like mourners. The sky remained low and leaden, promising more to come. Downstairs, breakfast was a subdued affair. The great dining table looked half empty with only 8 guests and Lady Evelyn at the head. Bates moved silently, serving porridge, kippers, and toast that had gone slightly cold in the draughts. The electric lights flickered now and then, as if protesting the strain on the generator. "Roads are quite impassable, milady," Bates informed them in a sepulchral tone. "Postman turned back at the lodge gates. Telephone still dead. We're properly cut off now." Captain Hargrove gave a short, humourless laugh. "Jolly good. A regular siege." Diana Lyle, wrapped in a dramatic fox fur stole, despite the warmth of the dining room, shivered theatrically. How utterly thrilling! Like being marooned on a desert island, only colder. Mrs. Bantry clutched Precious to her bosom. "I do hope the dear little creature won't catch a chill. He's very delicate, you know." Dr. Fenton murmured something about fresh air being beneficial, even in snow, but no one paid him much attention. Miss Marple buttered a piece of toast and observed. People revealed themselves most clearly, she had found, when routine was disrupted. Already the masks of polite society were slipping. After breakfast, the party drifted into the long drawing-room, where a huge fire blazed and the French windows showed nothing but swirling white. Someone suggested cards, but the idea died quickly. Instead, they sat in uneasy clusters, conversation starting and stopping like a faulty engine. Lady Evelyn tried valiantly to play hostess. She spoke of old Christmases at the manor, of sleigh rides and skating parties long ago. But her voice trembled slightly, and her eyes kept straying to the clock on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple settled herself in a high-winged armchair near the fire with her knitting. From this vantage point, she could watch everyone without appearing to do so. The needles clicked steadily. Another pair of bed socks for the St. Mary Mead Children's Home, while her mild blue eyes missed nothing. Captain Hargrove stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the snow as though willing it to stop. Every so often he glanced at his aunt with an expression that might have been concern or impatience. Mr. Julian Carver, the solicitor, had produced a leather-bound notebook and was making entries with a gold fountain pen. He caught Miss Marple looking and smiled smoothly. "Merely catching up on correspondence, dear lady. One must keep abreast of affairs, even in a blizzard." Diana Lyle prowled restlessly, lighting one cigarette from the stub of another. At one point, she paused beside Lady Evelyn's chair and touched the older woman's shoulder with apparent affection. "You look tired, darling. Shall I fetch your pills?" Lady Evelyn flinched almost imperceptibly. "No, thank you, my dear. Dr. Fenton sees to all that." Dr. Fenton himself sat apart, reading a medical journal, but Miss Marple noticed that he turned fewer pages than one might expect. His gaze kept drifting to Diana, then to Captain Hargrove, then to the door. Mrs. Bantry talked incessantly to anyone who would listen, mostly about the unreliability of servants these days and the shocking price of coal. Precious yapped whenever anyone moved suddenly. Around 11 o'clock the lights failed altogether. There was a collective gasp, followed by nervous laughter as Bates and the maids appeared with oil lamps and candles. Shadows leapt across the panelled walls, making the suits of armour in the hall look suddenly menacing. "Generator's given up the ghost," Captain Hargrove announced after a brief consultation with the butler. "We'll have to manage with lamps until the storm eases." The loss of electricity seemed to loosen tongues. Perhaps darkness always did. Miss Marple overheard fragments as people moved about the room. Diana, in a low voice to Mr. Carver near the fireplace, "Absolutely desperate, Julian. If she changes her mind again." Carver's murmured reply, "Perfectly legal, my dear, but timing is everything." Later, Mrs. Bantry cornered Dr. Fenton by the window. "Doctor, I simply must ask, do you think Evelyn's heart could stand another shock? All this worry about the estate?" Fenton's reply was too soft to catch, but his face looked grave. Captain Hargrove, passing Miss Marple's chair with a brandy glass in hand, paused. "Dashed awkward this weather. Aunt's not as strong as she used to be. Needs peace and quiet, really." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Yet she invited a house party, Captain." He gave a tight smile. "Yes, well, she's always been impulsive." Lunch was cold meats, and soup kept hot on a spirit stove. Afterwards, some attempted a walk in the sheltered courtyard, but the snow was too deep and the wind too bitter. They soon retreated, stamping snow from their boots and complaining of the cold. In the afternoon the storm grew worse. The wind howled like a living thing around the eaves, and snow piled against the lower windows until only a dim grey light filtered through. The house felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in. Miss Marple suggested a game of patience at a small table, and several guests gathered round, more for occupation than enthusiasm. Diana Lyle proved surprisingly skilled, laying out the cards with quick, impatient movements. "Patience is all very well," she said lightly, "but I prefer games with higher stakes." Captain Hargrove, watching, gave a short laugh. "Everything's high stakes these days, Diana." There was a sudden silence. Lady Evelyn, who had joined them, looked sharply at her nephew, then away. At tea time, a small incident occurred that set nerves further on edge. Lady Evelyn's famous pearl necklace, 3 strands of perfectly matched pearls that she always wore for dinner, was discovered missing from the velvet case in her dressing room. She mentioned it quietly to Mrs. Grayson, but word spread quickly. Searches were made, drawers opened, cushions lifted. Mrs. Bantry became quite hysterical, insisting that Precious had seen an intruder in the corridor. Diana offered to help search the guest bedrooms, but Lady Evelyn refused with unexpected firmness. "Nothing has been stolen," she said at last, pale but composed. "I must have mislaid them. They will turn up." No one quite believed her, but the subject was dropped. As darkness fell early, around 4 o'clock, the party gathered again in the drawing-room. Candles and oil lamps cast pools of warm light, but the corners remained in shadow. The wind screamed without pause. Dr. Fenton suggested music. There was an old gramophone in the corner, and soon the strains of a Strauss waltz filled the room, thin and scratchy, but better than silence. Diana danced a few steps alone, arms outstretched as though with an invisible partner. Then she caught Captain Hargrove's hand and pulled him into the centre of the rug. They danced competently, but there was tension in every movement. Miss Marple watched from her chair, needles still clicking. Later, when the record ended, Diana dropped into a sofa beside Mr. Carver and said in a voice meant to carry, "Darling Julian, do tell us about Evelyn's new will. We're all dying of curiosity." Carver's face froze. Lady Evelyn rose abruptly and left the room. Captain Hargrove's brandy glass snapped in his hand. A thin line of blood appeared across his palm, but he seemed not to notice. The evening stretched ahead, long and uncomfortable. Dinner would be late. Servants struggling with primitive cooking arrangements. The snow continued to fall. Miss Marple wound her wool neatly and put away her knitting. She had seen enough for one day. People under strain, she reflected, were like threads pulled too tight, ready to fray or snap. Secrets were pressing close in this isolated house, and the storm was keeping them all together long enough for those secrets to surface. She rose quietly and went upstairs to rest before dinner. In the corridor, she passed Dr. Fenton emerging from Lady Evelyn's room, his medical bag in hand. He looked startled to see her. "Just a mild sedative," he said quickly. "Her ladyship is overwrought." Miss Marple nodded pleasantly and continued to her room. From her window, she could see nothing but white darkness and the occasional whirl of snow against the glass. Somewhere out there were roads, villages, the ordinary world, but it might as well have been another planet. Inside Snowstorm Manor, 8 people waited for the storm to end, each carrying their own burden of fear, greed, or guilt. And one quiet old lady from St. Mary Mead waited too, listening to the whispers in the whiteout. Chapter 3. The Midnight Discovery. The house settled into an uneasy quiet after dinner. The meal had been simple but adequate. Roast pheasant kept warm over spirit lamps, followed by tinned fruit and custard. But the conversation had dwindled to almost nothing. By 10 o'clock, most of the party had drifted off to their rooms, pleading fatigue. Only Captain Hargrove lingered in the library with a decanter of whisky, staring moodily into the dying fire. Miss Marple, who had retired early with a book, found sleep elusive. The wind still battered the manor, rattling the window panes and sending draughts whispering under her door. She lay awake, listening to the old house creak and groan, until the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight with deep, mournful chimes. She must have dozed, for the scream that followed jerked her upright in bed, heart-pounding. It was high, piercing, unmistakably feminine, and it came from the ground floor. Miss Marple reached for her dressing gown and slippers. By the time she opened her door, lights were appearing along the corridor, candles and oil lamps bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps as other guests emerged. "What the devil?" Captain Hargrove's voice boomed from the stairs, rough with sleep and whisky. Diana Lyle appeared in a silk negligee, the colour of champagne, her blonde hair tumbling loose. "That was Evelyn! I'd know her voice anywhere." They hurried down together, a small procession of flickering lights. Dr. Fenton was already ahead, medical bag in hand, his bedroom being closest to the main staircase. Mrs. Bantry followed, clutching Precious and whimpering. Mr. Carver brought up the rear, adjusting his spectacles and looking pale. The scream had come from the library. The heavy oak door stood ajar, a wedge of lamplight spilling into the dark hall. Dr. Fenton pushed it wide and stopped so suddenly that Diana almost collided with him. "Good God!" he whispered. Lady Evelyn Hargrove stood in the centre of the room, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointing rigidly at the floor behind the large partner's desk. Her face was ashen in the lamplight. On the Persian rug lay Captain Richard Hargrove, face down, one arm flung out, as though reaching for something just beyond his grasp. A dark stain had spread across the back of his tweed jacket, soaking through to the rug beneath. Beside his outstretched hand lay a brass letter opener, its blade dark and wet. For a moment, no one moved. Then Diana gave a small, choked cry and swayed. Mr. Carver caught her elbow. Dr. Fenton recovered first. He knelt swiftly, felt for a pulse at the neck, then gently turned the body over. Captain Hargrove's eyes stared sightlessly at the coffered ceiling. A thin line of blood had trickled from the corner of his mouth. "He's dead," Fenton said quietly. "Stabbed through the heart. Can't have been more than 10 or 15 minutes ago." Lady Evelyn made a strangled sound and sank into the nearest chair. Mrs. Bantry began to sob loudly, Precious yapping in sympathy. Miss Marple stepped forward quietly, candle in hand, and surveyed the scene with her mild, deceptively gentle gaze. She noted several things at once. The French windows that opened onto the terrace were standing slightly ajar, letting in a draught of icy air and a few swirling flakes of snow. On the polished floorboards just inside the threshold were several wet patches, footprints perhaps, though already melting and indistinct. Outside, the snow on the terrace was deep and undisturbed, except for a single set of prints leading from the window to the balustrade, and then vanishing into the darkness beyond. The desk drawer was open. Papers lay scattered as though someone had been searching hurriedly. A half-empty whiskey glass stood on the blotter, beside an open cigar box with 2 cigars missing. Captain Hargrove's wristwatch had stopped at 11:47. "Someone should close those windows," Miss Marple said calmly. "We don't want more snow blowing in." Mr. Carver moved to do so, but Dr. Fenton stopped him. Better not touch anything yet. Though with the telephone dead and the roads blocked, the police won't get here for days. "Days," Mrs. Bantry wailed. "But there's a murderer among us." An uncomfortable silence fell. Everyone looked at everyone else. Lady Evelyn found her voice at last. It was thin, but steady. "Richard came down after dinner for a nightcap. He often did. I couldn't sleep, so I came to find a book. I opened the door and found him like this." She shuddered violently. Diana knelt beside her, stroking her hand. "You poor darling, what a dreadful shock." Miss Marple's eyes travelled slowly around the room. The library was large, lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and tobacco. A second door led to the billiard room. It was closed and, she noticed, bolted from the inside. The only other entrance was the one from the hall, which they had all used. She bent, she was remarkably supple for her age, and examined the wet patches near the French windows more closely. The prints were small, narrow, healed perhaps, though the melting snow made it hard to be certain. They led both in and out. "Someone went out that way," she murmured, almost to herself. Dr. Fenton glanced at her sharply. "Or came in. Though why anyone would brave this storm—" Captain Hargrove's overcoat still hung on the stand by the hall door. He had not gone outside himself then. His shoes were dry. Mr. Carver cleared his throat. "We ought to do something. Move him, perhaps. Cover him." "No," Dr. Fenton said firmly. "Best leave everything exactly as it is. Though I suppose one of us should keep watch in case the killer returns." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. No one volunteered immediately. Miss Marple straightened. "I will sit here for a while, if Lady Evelyn wishes to rest. I am quite awake now." Lady Evelyn looked at her gratefully. "Thank you, Jane. I believe I will go upstairs. Diana, would you—" "Of course, darling." Diana helped her to her feet and led her out. Mrs. Bantry followed, still sniffling. The three men remained. Dr. Fenton busied himself examining the body more closely without moving it unduly. Mr. Carver paced, hands in pockets. Miss Marple settled into a leather armchair near the fire, with her candle on a small table beside her, looking for all the world like a benign elderly lady keeping vigil. After a moment, Carver stopped pacing. "This is ghastly. Richard was— well, we had our differences, but—" "Differences?" Dr. Fenton looked up. Carver hesitated. "Estate matters. The usual family complications. Nothing serious." Miss Marple noted that he did not meet anyone's eyes. Dr. Fenton stood. "The wound is clean, single thrust, straight to the heart. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, or was very lucky, or very angry," Miss Marple said softly. Both men looked at her. She continued in her gentle voice. "The letter opener was taken from the desk, I think. It matches the set there. An impulse weapon, perhaps? Someone surprised him or argued with him." Carver gave a nervous laugh. "Argument? Richard wasn't the argumentative sort." Dr. Fenton's expression was grave. He could be forceful when it came to money. Silence fell again. Outside, the wind howled as though mourning. At length, Carver excused himself, saying he would check that the other doors were secure. Dr. Fenton lingered, then followed him out, leaving Miss Marple alone with the dead man and the flickering candle. She did not move for a long time. Her eyes travelled over every detail. The position of the body, the scattered papers, mostly bills and a half-written letter to a solicitor, the stopped watch, the footprints melting slowly into water. At one point she rose and examined the French windows. The catch was old and stiff, but not broken. Whoever had opened them had done so deliberately. Snow had drifted just inside the sill, enough to show that they had been open for several minutes at least. She looked out into the whirling darkness. The terrace dropped away into the gardens, now buried deep. Whoever had gone that way had known the grounds well enough to vanish into the storm, without leaving further trace. Miss Marple closed the windows gently and fastened the catch. Then she returned to her chair. Upstairs, she could hear faint sounds, doors closing, muffled voices, someone crying. The house was awake now, and would not sleep again this night. She thought of the people she had met only yesterday, each with their private tensions, their guarded glances. Someone among them had crossed the library in the last hour, picked up the letter opener, and driven it into Richard Hargrove's heart. And then, most curiously, had gone out into the blizzard rather than simply leave by the hall door. Why? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and waited patiently in the dancing candlelight, listening to the storm and to the deeper, more dangerous currents stirring within Snowstorm Manor. The night was far from over. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The morning after the murder dawned grey and oppressive, the snow still falling in thick, relentless curtains that blurred the line between earth and sky. Snowstorm Manor felt heavier, as though the weight of the drifts outside pressed down on the roof and seeped into the very walls. Breakfast was a grim affair. Untouched toast, congealed eggs, and coffee that tasted of chicory and despair. No one spoke of the library, where Captain Hargrove's body lay covered with a sheet, guarded in turns by the men. The police, Dr. Fenton had confirmed after a futile attempt to raise help on the old wireless set, could not reach them for days, perhaps a week. Lady Evelyn did not appear. Diana Lyle reported that she was prostrate with grief and under sedation. Mrs. Bantry kept to her room, claiming nervous exhaustion, though her maid was seen carrying trays up and down the stairs. The remaining guests gathered in the drawing room, wrapped in shawls and unease, the fire doing little to dispel the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Miss Marple, ever practical, suggested fresh air might clear their heads. A short turn in the courtyard, perhaps. The snow has eased a trifle. No one argued. Bundled in coats and scarves, they ventured out into the enclosed space behind the manor, a flagged area surrounded by high stone walls, now half buried. The air was sharp, biting at lungs accustomed to stuffy rooms. Footprints from previous aborted walks crisscrossed the snow, but Miss Marple noted with interest that none led to the library's French windows on the adjacent terrace. Whoever had fled that way had known to skirt the walls or use the deeper drifts. Back inside, warmed by hot toddies, the barriers began to crumble. Isolation and fear worked like solvents on polite reserve. Miss Marple, sensing the moment, engaged each in turn with her disarming village chatter. People she knew talked most freely to someone who seemed harmless. She began with Mr. Julian Carver in the conservatory, where frost etched the glass panes like lace. He was attempting to read a law journal by lamplight, but his eyes were unfocused. "A dreadful business, Mr. Carver," Miss Marple said, settling beside him with her knitting. "In my little village of St. Mary Mead, we had a similar tragedy once. A verger found stabbed in the vestry. Turned out to be over a disputed will, of all things." Carver closed the journal with a snap. "Wills can be contentious. Captain Hargrove and I had discussions about Lady Evelyn's estate. He was concerned she might alter it again." "Again?" Miss Marple's needles clicked innocently. Carver hesitated, then sighed. This would be the third version in 2 years. First, everything to Richard as heir. Then, after some family disagreement, she cut him down to a modest annuity and favoured charities. Lately, she'd been talking of reinstating him, or perhaps leaving the bulk to Miss Lyle. Diana? But she's no relation. Carver's smile was thin. No, but they've been close since Diana's debut on the stage. Evelyn sponsored her early roles. There's talk of companionship in her later years. Richard was furious, saw it as his inheritance slipping away to a scheming actress. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Money does bring out the shadows in people. And you, Mr. Carver? As solicitor, you must see much of that. He shifted uncomfortably. I merely draft the documents. But yes, Richard accused me of influencing his aunt against him. We argued yesterday about the trust funds. He owed debts, you see, gambling. The war left him unsettled. A picture emerged. Captain Hargrove, decorated officer turned restless heir, chafing under his aunt's capricious generosity. Debts mounting, future uncertain. Later, in the music room, Miss Marple found Diana Lyle at the piano, picking out a melancholy Chopin nocturne. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her makeup was flawless. Play something cheerful, my dear, Miss Marple suggested. Music soothes the savage breast, they say. Diana's fingers stilled. Nothing feels cheerful now. Poor Ricky. We were engaged once, you know, before the war. He proposed in 38, all fire and promises. Then he went off to Dunkirk and came back, changed. War changes everyone, Miss Marple murmured. "My nephew was in the RAF. Lost friends, you see." Diana lit a cigarette with trembling hands. Ricky lost more than friends. He was captured, escaped, but not before. Well, there were rumours. Collaboration to save his skin. Nothing proven, but it haunted him. And Evelyn knew. That's why she wavered on the will. She loved him as a son, but doubted his character. Miss Marple leaned forward. "And you, Miss Lyle, where do you fit in this family tapestry?" Diana laughed bitterly. "The interloper, darling. Evelyn took me under her wing when I was a starving ingenue, taught me poise, lent me gowns. In return, I brighten her days, read to her, gossip, keep the loneliness at bay. Ricky hated it, called me a parasite. We fought terribly last month when I visited. He struck me." She touched her wrist absently, where Miss Marple had noted the faint bruise. "Yet you came to this house party. Evelyn insisted, said it was time to mend fences. But Ricky cornered me yesterday afternoon in the billiard room, threatened to expose some old scandal of mine if I didn't persuade Evelyn to sign the new will favouring him. A silly affair with a married producer. Ancient history, but it would ruin my comeback." Tears glistened. "I refused. He was alive when I left him at 11:30. I went straight to bed." Miss Marple patted her hand. Tempers flare in confined spaces. Like the time in St. Mary Mead, when Mrs. Price accused the baker of short-waiting loaves. Turned out to be a misunderstanding over ration books. But Diana's story added layers. Jealousy. Old loves poisoned by suspicion. Threats veiled and unveiled. Dr. Fenton was next, in the small study where he had set up a makeshift surgery. He was measuring drops into a bottle, his movements precise but weary. "A trying time for a physician," Miss Marple observed, "especially with no post-mortem possible." Fenton capped the bottle. "I've done what I can, certified death by stabbing. But yes, without proper facilities," he trailed off. "You've known the family long?" "Since Richard was a boy. Treated his mother for consumption. She died young. Evelyn leaned on me after. And Richard. Shell shock after the war. Nightmares, morphine at one point. I weaned him off, but he resented the control." Miss Marple's eyes were kindly. "Addiction is a cruel shadow. And Lady Evelyn's health?" Fenton's face tightened. "Heart trouble, angina. I've warned her about excitement. This could kill her." Richard pressured her relentlessly. "Yesterday, I overheard him in the hall. Sign it, Aunt, or I'll contest everything." She was trembling afterward. "And the missing pearls?" Miss Marple asked softly. Fenton started. "Pearls? Evelyn mentioned mislaying them. Probably nothing." But his evasion was clear. Miss Marple recalled the medicinal scent in the hall on arrival. Laudanum, perhaps, or something stronger. Mrs. Bantry provided the final piece over tea in her bedroom, a fussy bower of chintz and photographs. Precious snoozed on the eiderdown. "Amelia, my dear," Miss Marple said, using the Christian name as invited, "you mentioned investments yesterday. Were you and Captain Hargrove connected in business?" Mrs. Bantry fluttered. "Oh, a trifling matter. My late husband left shares in a mining company. Richard persuaded me to invest more last year. Promised riches from African diamonds, but the returns never came. He said the war delayed things, but I suspect embezzlement. I confronted him 2 days ago. He laughed, said old widows were easy marks." Her cheeks flushed. "I was in the library at 11:15, looking for a book on annuities. He was at the desk, rummaging papers. We argued, I left in a huff, through the hall door, but I swear I saw a shadow by the French windows. Someone watching. Miss Marple soothed her with tales of a St. Mary Mead swindle involving fake antiques, but her mind raced. Motives proliferated. Inheritance for Carver's client, or himself. Companionship and security for Diana. Professional control and perhaps unrequited affection for Fenton. Financial recovery for Mrs. Bantry. Lady Evelyn herself remained elusive until evening. Miss Marple found her in the boudoir, propped among pillows, a shawl about her shoulders. "Jane," she whispered, "forgive my weakness. Richard, my brother's only child. I loved him, but he frightened me latterly. The war broke something in him." Miss Marple sat. "Children can disappoint. Like young Leonard in my village, stole from his mother for drink." Evelyn's eyes filled. "Richard forged my signature once, on a cheque. I forgave, but then the debts, the threats. He wanted the manor sold to pay gamblers. I changed the will to protect it. For a museum, perhaps. Diana understood, the others resented. And the pearls? A pause. Richard took them last month, pawned for cash. I pretended they were lost to spare scandal. But he promised to redeem them." Flashbacks wove through their talk. Young Ricky in sailor suits, heroic letters from the front, then the hollow-eyed veteran demanding his due. Affairs hinted. Richard and Diana reignited briefly, ending in bitterness. Dr. Fenton's quiet devotion rebuffed. Carver's fees swelling with each will revision. Mrs. Bantry's naive trust abused. As night fell, the group dined in silence, alliances shifting like snowdrifts. Accusations simmered. Diana's bracelet matching a description in Richard's debt ledger. Fenton's access to poisons, Carver's footprints, or were they, near the terrace. Miss Marple retired early, but sleep evaded her. The manor's confines forced confrontations. Doors left ajar, revealed whispers, stairs creaked under furtive steps. She drew parallels to village feuds, the Dane Calthrop poisoning over a legacy, the harmonium players stabbing amid choir rivalries. Body language betrayed. Carver's averted gaze when money arose. Diana's defensive poise. Fenton's protective hovering over Evelyn. Mrs. Bantry's vindictive glances. Alibis fractured under scrutiny. Diana claimed bed at 11:30, but her maid heard her door at midnight. Fenton read in his room, yet his journal marker hadn't moved. Carver checked locks, passing the library at 11:45 by Bates's testimony. Mrs. Bantry retired early, but pressures barked at 11:50 per a maid. The killer had struck between 11:47, stopped watch, and midnight, scream, impulse, or plan. Miss Marple's mind, like her knitting, wove threads into pattern. Shadows of the past lengthened, pointing to present peril. The storm raged on, but inside, the true blizzard of deceit and desperation was only beginning. Chapter 5. The Frozen Alibi. The third day of the blizzard broke with a strange, muffled stillness. The wind had dropped to a low moan, and the snow fell in large, lazy flakes that drifted past the windows like feathers. Yet the drifts outside were higher than ever. The manor remained a white island in a frozen sea. No help could come, and the inhabitants of Snowstorm Manor moved through the hours like actors in a play none of them had chosen. Captain Hargrove's body still lay in the library under its sheet. Dr. Fenton had declared that in the absence of ice or formaldehyde, it must stay there until the authorities arrived. The room had become a place to avoid. Even the maids skirted it with averted eyes. The rest of the house felt tainted by association. Corridors seemed narrower, ceilings lower, every creak of timber a footstep. Breakfast was almost silent. Lady Evelyn appeared briefly, pale and composed in black, supported by Diana Lyle. She ate nothing, spoke to no one, and withdrew again. Mrs. Bantry sent down word that her nerves could not bear company. The 4 remaining guests, Miss Marple, Dr. Fenton, Mr. Carver and Diana, sat at one end of the long table, picking at food while Bates hovered like a sympathetic ghost. After the meal, Dr. Fenton proposed a systematic attempt to reconstruct the previous night's movements. "We cannot interrogate properly," he said, "but we can at least establish a timeline, for our own peace of mind, if nothing else." No one objected. They gathered in the drawing-room with notebooks and the great chiming clock on the mantel as their witness. Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual corner, knitting a navy-blue muffler, her mild eyes encouraging others to speak. The clock had been the one reliable timekeeper since the electricity failed. Its deep Westminster chimes marked every quarter hour, audible throughout most of the house. Diana began, voice steady, but hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I left the billiard room at 11:30 after my discussion with Ricky. I went straight upstairs. My room is at the end of the east corridor. I undressed, creamed my face, and read a little. Somerset Maugham. I heard the clock strike 12 just as I turned out the lamp." Mr. Carver cleared his throat. "I retired earlier, about 11:15, after checking the ground floor windows and doors. Bates accompanied me. We bolted the front door at 11:20 precisely. I then went to my room on the west corridor, wrote letters by candlelight, and was in bed by 11:40. The clock chimed 3/4 as I blew out the candle, and midnight shortly after." Dr. Fenton nodded. "I was in the study until 11:30, finishing notes. I passed Miss Marple in the corridor. She was going to her room. I then visited Lady Evelyn to give her a mild sedative. I left her at 11:45. The clock struck the 3/4 as I reached my own door. I read a medical journal until midnight. Miss Marple looked up. I myself went upstairs at 11:25, after a few words with Mrs. Bantry in the hall. I heard the half-hour chime while brushing my hair, the 3/4 while saying my prayers, and midnight just as I got into bed. I did not sleep immediately, but I heard nothing unusual until Lady Evelyn's scream. All eyes turned to the servants who had been summoned. Bates spoke first, voice grave. "I locked up with Mr. Carver at 11:20, sir. Then I made my rounds, kitchen, pantries, scullery. Mrs. Grayson and the maids had retired to their attic rooms. I was in my pantry off the kitchen when the clock struck 12. I heard nothing amiss until the scream. Mrs. Grayson corroborated. The female servants had been abed since 11. Mrs. Bantry, fetched downstairs wrapped in shawls, was tearful but precise. I went up at 11 sharp. My nerves, you know. Precious needed his little walk in the corridor. We were back in the room by 11:15. I heard the half-hour, the 3/4, then barking from Precious at about 10 minutes to 12. He saw a mouse, I think. I hushed him, and we settled again. The midnight chime woke me slightly, but I dozed off. The timeline seemed solid, yet Captain Hargrove had died between 11:47, his stopped watch, and midnight. Everyone claimed to be in their rooms by 11:45 at latest. The hall door to the library had been under observation during lock-up. The billiard-room door was bolted from inside. Only the French windows remained. And those told a different story. After luncheon, a scratch meal of soup and cold pie, Miss Marple suggested they examine the terrace while daylight lasted. The snow had stopped entirely, leaving a crisp, glittering world. They trooped outside in boots and coats. The single set of footprints leading from the library windows was still visible, though softened by fresh fall. They began at the sill, narrow and deep-toed, clearly made by someone leaving the room. The prince crossed the terrace, descended 3 stone steps into the rose garden, and then, astonishingly, turned sharply left along the house wall toward the old boot room at the rear. Dr. Fenton frowned. Why not straight into the drifts? Easier to disappear that way. Because, Miss Marple said quietly, the murderer wished to return to the house without being seen from any window. They followed the trail. It hugged the wall, taking advantage of a narrow shoveled path the gardeners had kept clear earlier in the week, now half filled but still passable. The prince ended at the boot room door, which opened inward. Inside, the small stone room smelled of damp galoshes and polish. Several pairs of outdoor shoes and boots lined the shelves. On the floor lay a single wet patch, already drying, and on a hook hung a woman's black cloak, Lady Evelyn's by the monogram, its hem soaked and crusted with snow. Diana gasped, "That's Evelyn's cloak! She wore it yesterday morning!" Mr. Carver's face was grim. So the killer went out, circled the house, and re-entered here. This door leads directly to the back stairs, servants' stairs, up to the bedroom corridors. Dr. Fenton examined the cloak. Worn recently. Snow still melting. Miss Marple's gaze travelled upward. A faint trail of damp spots led across the flagstones to the inner door. They climbed the narrow stairs in silence. The trail continued, single wet footprints on the oilcloth, up to the first floor, then along the east corridor to the very end, Diana Lyle's room. Diana stopped dead. "This is absurd! I was in bed!" The door was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared orderly. Bed turned down, novel on the nightstand, cold cream jar neatly capped. But under the bed, pushed far back, they found a pair of sodden black walking shoes, size 5, Diana's size, and a pair of delicate kid gloves, stiff with ice. Diana stared at them as though they belonged to a stranger. "Those aren't mine. I have no such shoes, and I never wear black gloves. Ruins the hands." Yet the shoes bore the label of a London shop where Diana was known to buy, and the gloves smelled faintly of her distinctive gardenia perfume. The discovery shattered the fragile calm. Voices rose. Carver demanded explanations. Fenton looked shaken. Diana protested vehemently, near tears. Miss Marple alone remained calm. She examined the shoes closely. "Curious," she murmured. "The left one has a patch on the sole, new leather, and the right heel is worn distinctly outward. I noticed yesterday that Miss Lyle's evening slippers have perfectly even heels. She stands like a dancer, weight balanced." Diana seized on this. "There! You see, someone is trying to make it look like me." But suspicion had taken root. The afternoon brought a second shock. Tea was being served in the drawing room when Mrs. Grayson entered, face ashen, carrying a silver tray. On it lay a small crystal glass with a trace of liquid at the bottom. "I found this in Miss Lyle's wastebasket, milady," she said to the room at large, since Lady Evelyn was absent. "Smells of bitter almonds. I thought, with the captain poisoned in stories." Dr. Fenton took the glass, sniffed cautiously. "Prussic acid, hydrocyanic. Enough here to kill in minutes. Where exactly?" "In the basket, wrapped in a handkerchief, Miss Lyle's, embroidered DL." Diana rose, white to the lips. "I drank nothing of the sort. Someone is framing me, deliberately." Carver's voice was cold. "Rather too many someones, Miss Lyle. First the footprints leading to your room, now poison in your possession." Fenton intervened. "The glass is from the morning room. Anyone could have taken it. And prussic acid. I keep a small amount in my bag for emergencies, heart cases. The bag has been in the study, unlocked." Eyes turned to him now. The room crackled with accusation. Miss Marple quietly suggested they all retire to separate rooms until tempers cooled. Remarkably, everyone agreed. Later, alone in the conservatory as dusk fell, Miss Marple pieced together the day's revelations. The footprints proved the killer had left and re-entered the house, ruling out an outside intruder. The cloak and shoes pointed to a woman, small-footed, yet the heels did not match Diana's posture. The poison glass, if genuine, suggested either an aborted second murder or a deliberate plant. She recalled the clock chimes, heard by everyone, yet allowing a narrow window. From the boot room to the east corridor took less than 2 minutes at a brisk pace. A person could leave the library at 11:48, circle the house, change shoes, and be in their room by 11:55, before the midnight chime. But why the elaborate exit into the snow at all? To create confusion, Miss Marple thought, to suggest either an outsider or someone desperate to escape detection. Yet the return proved planning, not panic, and the poison? Bitter almonds in a house where Dr. Fenton admitted keeping cyanide, a red herring, or insurance if the stabbing failed. She looked out at the frozen gardens. Somewhere beneath the innocent snow lay the truth, buried but waiting. Upstairs, doors were locked tonight. Trust had frozen solid. Miss Marple wound her wool, counting stitches carefully. Human nature, under pressure, revealed its cracks. Greed, fear, love turned sour. All were present here. But one person had crossed the line into murder, and now into attempted misdirection. The storm might be easing, but the danger inside Snowstorm Manor was only deepening. Chapter 6. Echoes of Deception. The fourth day brought a deceptive calm. The snow had ceased entirely during the night, leaving the world outside Snowstorm Manor wrapped in a thick, glittering quilt beneath a pale, wintry sun. Icicles hung like daggers from the eaves, and the air was so still that every sound inside the house seemed magnified. The creak of floorboards, the tick of the grandfather clock, the nervous cough of someone in a distant room. Yet no rescue came. The telephone remained dead, the roads impassable. A brief expedition to the lodge gates confirmed that drifts rose to 12 feet in places. They were still prisoners. Tension inside the manor had reached breaking point after the discovery of the poisoned glass and the incriminating footprints. Diana Lyle had spent the night locked in her room at her own request, declaring she would not be safe otherwise. Dr. Fenton had stationed himself outside Lady Evelyn's door with a revolver borrowed from the gun room. Mr. Carver and Bates had taken turns patrolling the corridors. Even Mrs. Bantry had armed herself with a poker from her fireplace. Miss Marple alone seemed unperturbed. She breakfasted early, then suggested to Bates that the housemaids might appreciate a little occupation. Idle hands breed fear, she said mildly. Perhaps they could polish the silver in the pantry. I will sit with them. The maids, pale and jumpy, were grateful for her calm presence. While they worked, Miss Marple listened. Servants saw everything, and fear had loosened tongues. It was the scullery maid, Elsie, who provided the first useful whisper. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I saw Miss Lyle's shoes drying by the boot-room stove yesterday morning. Black walking ones, soaked through. She said she'd been out early for fresh air, but no one else stirred before 9. The parlour-maid added, "And that cloak of her ladyship's, Mrs. Grayson found it hanging in Miss Lyle's wardrobe 2 days ago when she aired the room. Said Miss Lyle borrowed it for a laugh." Miss Marple thanked them quietly and filed the information away. After luncheon, another makeshift meal eaten in near silence, Miss Marple proposed a search for hidden passages. Old houses like this often have them, she said. Priest holes, smugglers' tunnels. It would explain how someone moved about unseen. No one objected. Anything was better than sitting under mutual suspicion. Armed with candles, they began in the cellar. Snowstorm Manor yielded its secrets grudgingly. Behind the wine racks they found a narrow door concealed by panelling, leading to a dusty passage that ran the length of the west wing. It emerged behind a tapestry in the billiard room, the door that had been bolted from inside on the night of the murder. "Bolted by someone who knew the passage," Mr. Carver observed grimly. The passage continued upward, branching to several bedrooms, including Diana's and Lady Evelyn's. A third branch led down to the boot room, the same route the wet footprints had suggested. Diana, who had been allowed to join the search under escort, turned pale. "Anyone could have used this. It proves nothing against me." But the discovery shifted suspicion further onto those familiar with the house's secrets. Lady Evelyn herself, Dr. Fenton, a frequent visitor, and possibly Captain Hargrove. In the afternoon the storm returned briefly, a short but violent squall that rattled the windows and plunged the house into twilight gloom. During the lull that followed, Miss Marple took Dr. Fenton aside in the study. "Doctor, may I see your medical bag? Purely for my own reassurance." Fenton hesitated, then unlocked it. Inside were the usual instruments, vials, and a small brown bottle labelled acid, hydrocyanic, dill. The level was lower than he expected. "Someone has taken some," he said quietly. "Enough for that glass." Miss Marple nodded. "And the forgery you mentioned, Captain Hargrove's forged cheque, do you still have it?" Fenton produced a locked drawer in the desk. Inside lay not only the cheque, but a bundle of letters. Love letters from Diana to Richard during the war, passionate and indiscreet, and later ones from Richard to a London moneylender, desperate and threatening. "Richard showed me these when he asked me to witness the new will," Fenton said. "He wanted leverage over Diana." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the handwriting. Richard's was bold and angular, Diana's looping and theatrical. But one letter, supposedly from Diana begging Richard to elope, had ink smudges and phrasing oddly formal. "Curious," she murmured. The climax of the day came just before dinner. Mr. Carver, exploring the attics alone, gave a sudden shout. The others hurried up narrow stairs to find him in a lumber room beneath the eaves, holding a small leather jewel case. Inside lay Lady Evelyn's missing pearl necklace, together with a pawn ticket dated 3 weeks earlier, and a forged note purporting to be from Lady Evelyn, authorizing the transaction, signed in a hand that mimicked hers but with telling differences. The capital E too looped, the Y's tail too long. Carver's face was flushed. This was hidden behind a beam. Someone meant it to be found eventually, perhaps to discredit Richard posthumously. Or to discredit someone else, Miss Marple thought. Dinner was a tense affair. Lady Evelyn joined them for the first time since the murder, supported by Diana. She looked frail, but determined. "I owe you all an explanation," she said quietly as soup was served. "Richard did take my pearls. He confessed a fortnight ago, promised to redeem them. I forgave him, family, after all, but the forgery—" her voice trembled— "that I could not forgive. I had decided to cut him out entirely." Diana reached for her hand. "You poor darling. He didn't deserve you." Carver cleared his throat. "With respect, Lady Evelyn, the new will was never signed. Legally, Richard remained your heir. Unless," Dr. Fenton said slowly. Someone ensured he did not live to inherit. The words hung in the air. After dinner, as the party dispersed warily, Miss Marple lingered in the hall with Bates. "Tell me, Bates, did Captain Hargrove ever mention hidden passages?" "Often, miss. As a boy he played in them. Showed them to Miss Diana when she visited years ago, before the war, and to Dr. Fenton, who used the one to the study when nursing her ladyship privately." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Later, unable to sleep, she slipped downstairs in her dressing gown. The house was dark save for the dying fire in the drawing-room. She made her way to the library, now unlocked, and stood looking at the chalk outline where Richard's body had lain. Something had puzzled her from the first. The stopped watch at 11:47. Watches did not stop precisely at the moment of death, unless deliberately tampered with. She examined the desk again by candlelight. In the scattered papers she found what she sought, a heavy brass paperweight with a sharp corner, and on its base a tiny scratch of glass and metal. Richard's watch, she realized, had been smashed against it to stop the hands, to establish a false time of death. The French windows had been opened not for escape, but for misdirection. Snow blown in, footprints made outward. Then the killer circling back through the passage. But whose footprints? The shoes found in Diana's room did not fit her perfectly. Miss Marple had noticed Diana's dainty arch, while the wet shoes were flatter, broader. Mrs. Bantry's? No, too small. Lady Evelyn's own walking shoes, perhaps borrowed and returned, or someone else entirely. She moved to the French windows and looked out. The brief squall had covered old tracks, but from this angle she saw something new. A faint disturbance in the snow directly below the library terrace, a rectangular patch where something heavy had been dragged or dropped. Tomorrow, in daylight, she would investigate. Upstairs, a door closed softly. Footsteps padded along the corridor. Light, quick. Miss Marple extinguished her candle and waited in the shadows. A figure in a dark dressing gown passed the staircase. Diana, carrying something bundled in a towel. She descended the back stairs toward the boot room. Miss Marple followed at a distance. In the boot room, Diana knelt by the stove, feeding papers into the flames, letters by the look of them. As they burned, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of handwriting. Richard's bold scrawl. Diana was destroying evidence. But before Miss Marple could speak, another figure appeared in the doorway, Dr. Fenton, revolver in hand. "Diana," he said softly, "step away from the fire." Diana froze. "I heard you leave your room," Fenton continued. "You've been busy, haven't you? The poison, the planted shoes, the forged note in the attic, all to make it appear you were framed, when in fact you killed him." Diana rose slowly. "You can't prove anything. I can prove enough. Richard was blackmailing you with those letters. You met him here that night, stabbed him in rage, then staged the elaborate exit to suggest an outsider. But you forgot the passage and the watch." Miss Marple stepped forward into the lamplight. "No, Doctor, you are mistaken." Both turned, startled. "The watch was stopped deliberately, yes," Miss Marple said calmly, "but not by Miss Lyle. The shoes do not fit her. The poison came from your bag, and the passage was known to you as well as to her." Fenton's face twisted. "This is absurd, is it? You loved Lady Evelyn for years, quietly, hopelessly. Richard's behaviour threatened her health, her fortune, her peace. You saw the forged cheque, the pawn ticket, the blackmail. You decided to remove the threat." Diana stared at him. "That night," Miss Marple continued, "you waited in the passage. When Richard was alone, you entered, argued, struck him down. Then you staged the footprints using Lady Evelyn's cloak and a pair of old shoes from the boot room. shoes that happened to be near Diana's size. You planted the poison glass to cast suspicion on her, knowing Richard had been threatening her. The hidden necklace and forged note were to blacken his name after death, justifying the murder in Lady Evelyn's eyes. Fenton's hand tightened on the revolver. "You cannot prove this," he whispered. "But I can." Lady Evelyn's voice came from the stairs. She stood there in her dressing gown, pale but steady. "I heard everything. Marcus, how could you?" The revolver wavered. In the silence, the grandfather clock in the hall began to strike 2. Fenton's shoulders sagged. The gun clattered to the floor. "I did it for you, Evelyn," he said brokenly. "He would have destroyed you." Miss Marple picked up the revolver gently. "Human nature, Doctor. We all act from love, or what we believe is love, but murder remains murder." Outside, the first pale hint of dawn touched the snow-covered hills. The storm had passed, and with it the worst of the deception. But echoes lingered in Snowstorm Manor, and would for years to come. Chapter 7. The Storm's Revelation. The faint light of dawn crept through the frost-rimed windows of Snowstorm Manor, casting long shadows across the drawing room to where the survivors had gathered. The blizzard had finally broken. Outside, the sun glinted off the pristine snow like diamonds scattered across a frozen field. But inside, the air was thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of revelations yet to come. Captain Hargrove's body remained in the library, a silent witness to the night's confessions in the boot room. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily, a calming rhythm amid the chaos. Around her clustered the remaining guests, Lady Evelyn Hargrove, frail but resolute in her black morning gown, Diana Lyle, dishevelled yet defiant with her platinum hair pinned hastily, Dr. Marcus Fenton standing rigid by the window, his face ashen, Mr. Julian Carver, the solicitor, fidgeting with his cufflinks, Mrs. Amelia Bantry, clutching Precious like a talisman, and Bates the butler, hovering discreetly by the door. The revolver from the previous night's confrontation lay on the mantelpiece, unloaded, a symbol of the fragile peace. No one had slept. The discovery of the forged documents and the burning letters had shattered the last illusions of trust. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, breaking the heavy silence, "it is time we all heard the truth. No more shadows or deceptions. The storm trapped us here, but it also revealed what needed revealing." Lady Evelyn nodded weakly. "Please, Jane, I cannot bear another hour of this torment." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and leaned forward. "Very well. Let us begin at the beginning. The invitation to this house party. Lady Evelyn, you hoped to mend fences, but underlying it all was the question of your will. Captain Hargrove, Richard, had become a source of great distress. His war experiences left him broken. Debts from gambling, forged checks, even pawning your pearls. He threatened to contest any changes, to drag your name through scandal." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "He was my nephew, Jane. I loved him once as a son. But love can blind us," Miss Marple continued kindly. "Mr. Carver, as solicitor, you drafted multiple wills, the latest favoured charities, and Miss Lyle for her companionship. Richard learned of it and grew desperate." Carver nodded grimly. "He confronted me 2 days ago, accused me of undue influence, but I swear, I only followed instructions." Miss Marple's gaze shifted. "Now, the night of the murder. Richard was in the library at 11:45, arguing with someone, perhaps over the pawn ticket, or the blackmail letters he held over Miss Lyle. The watch was stopped deliberately at 11:47 to mislead us about the time. Diana gasped. But the footprints, the cloak, were a clever misdirection, Miss Marple said. The killer stabbed Richard impulsively during an argument, using the letter opener from the desk. Then, rather than flee by the hall door, risking being seen, they opened the French windows, stepped out to create outward footprints, circled the house using the shoveled path to the boot room, and re-entered via the hidden passage known to family and close associates. Mrs. Bantry whimpered. But who? And why such complication? To suggest an outsider, Miss Marple explained, or to cast suspicion on someone else. The wet shoes planted in Miss Lyle's room, the poisoned glass from Dr. Fenton's bag, these were added later to frame her. The pearls hidden in the attic, the forged note, all part of a plan to blacken Richard's name posthumously and justify the act. Dr. Rose Fenton stepped forward, voice hoarse. You accused me last night, Miss Marple. But I did not. Miss Marple raised a hand. Patience, Doctor. Let us examine motives. You, Dr. Fenton, have loved Lady Evelyn silently for years. You saw Richard destroying her health with his demands, his threats to her heart. You knew the passages from nursing her privately. You had access to cyanide. That night, you waited in the billiard room passage. An argument ensued, perhaps over the sedative you gave her or the morphine he once abused. In rage, you struck. Fenton's hands trembled. No, I was in my room. But your journal had not been turned since 11:30, Miss Marple said softly. And the prussic acid bottle was disturbed. Diana interrupted. It was me he was framing. Richard had those letters, my old indiscretions. He threatened to publish them. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, Miss Lyle, you had motive and opportunity. But the shoes did not fit your feet perfectly. The arch is wrong. And your perfume on the gloves was too obvious a plant. All eyes turned to Mr. Carver. He paled. Surely not me. I gain nothing. On the contrary, Miss Marple said. You stand to profit handsomely from the estate's administration. Multiple wills mean multiple fees. Richard owed you money too, from loans disguised as legal advances. You knew the passages. You checked the locks that night. But more damning, the handwriting on the forged note in the attic matches your own. Subtle flourishes in the capital letters, as in your notebook. Carver's composure cracked. This is preposterous. Is it? Miss Marple produced a small bundle from her knitting bag. The burnt remnants salvaged from the boot-room fire, pieced together by Bates earlier. These letters were not Diana's to Richard, but yours to a contact in London, arranging to fence the pearls further or forge documents. You burned them last night in panic. Lady Evelyn stared. Julian, you. Carver slumped into a chair. I didn't mean to kill him. We argued in the library. He found the pawn ticket I'd hidden, meant to use it against him later. He lunged at me. In the struggle, the letter opener was there. I panicked, staged the exit to look like suicide or an intruder. Then I planted evidence against Diana. She was the weakest link, the outsider. Diana recoiled. You monster! But the poison, Mrs. Bantry squeaked. A further misdirection, Miss Marple said. Slipped into the glass during tea, wrapped in Diana's handkerchief stolen from her room. And the watch smashed to fix the time before your alibi window closed. Carver's head bowed. The debts, the estate would cover them if he were gone, and Evelyn weakened. I thought it mercy. A stunned silence fell. Then Lady Evelyn spoke, voice breaking. Greed, Julian. Not love, not duty. Greed. Miss Marple rose. There is more. Mrs. Bantry, your argument with Richard over the investments. He had indeed embezzled. You heard the struggle from your room, Precious barking at 11:50, but you said nothing, hoping for inheritance through your shares. Mrs. Bantry flushed scarlet. I feared accusation. And Diana, you burned real letters last night, Richard's threats, destroying evidence, but not murder. Diana nodded tearfully. Dr. Fenton exhaled. Then I suspected wrongly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. We all did at times, but clues converge. Carver's presence near the library at 11:45 per Bates, his muddy shoes from the terrace path, the handwriting match. The group stared at Carver, who made no move to flee. Bates stepped forward with ropes from the cellar. Shall I secure him, miss? Yes, Miss Marple said, until the police arrive. As Bates bound Carver's wrists, a distant rumble echoed, the sound of a snowplough on the main road, finally breaking through. Help was coming. Lady Evelyn turned to Miss Marple. How did you know, Jane, amid all the lies? Miss Marple picked up her knitting. People are much the same in a village or a manor. Small inconsistencies, a stopped watch too perfect, footprints too deliberate, forgeries too convenient, and human nature, greed whispers loudest in isolation. The storm's revelation had come, peeling away deceptions like layers of snow. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, was not always swift, but in the quiet observations of an old lady, it found its way. Outside, the sun climbed higher, promising thaw. Chapter 8. Dawn After the Drift. As the first rays of a pale January sun pierced the heavy clouds over Snowstorm Manor, the world outside began to awaken from its frozen slumber. The blizzard, which had raged for days like a vengeful spirit, had finally spent its fury. Snowploughs rumbled along distant roads, their mechanical growls echoing faintly through the still air. The drifts that had imprisoned the manor began to recede under the tentative thaw, revealing buried hedges and frost-laced gates. Help was coming at last. Inside, the atmosphere was one of exhausted relief mingled with sorrow. The drawing room, where the group had gathered after Mr. Julian Carver's confession, now seemed less oppressive in the morning light. Lady Evelyn Hargrove sat by the fire, wrapped in a thick shawl, her face etched with lines of grief and betrayal. Beside her, Diana Lyle held her hand, offering silent comfort. Dr. Marcus Fenton paced slowly, his medical bag at his feet, ready for whatever came. Mrs. Amelia Bantry fussed over Precious, who yapped softly at the unfamiliar sounds from outside. Bates stood sentinel by the window, watching for the first signs of the authorities. Miss Jane Marple, ever the picture of composure, had resumed her knitting, a simple scarf in soft grey wool. She glanced up occasionally, her sharp eyes taking in the subtle shifts in her companions. The slump of Lady Evelyn's shoulders, the flicker of guilt in Dr. Fenton's gaze, the nervous energy in Diana's posture. Carver sat bound in a straight-backed chair near the door, his head bowed, the picture of defeat. The forged documents, the burnt letters and the mismatched shoes had sealed his fate. His motive, greed disguised as professional diligence, had unravelled like a poorly tied knot. I still cannot believe it, Lady Evelyn whispered, breaking the silence. Julian, whom I've trusted for decades, how could he? Miss Marple set her needles aside. People deceive themselves first, my dear. Mr. Carver saw opportunity in your changing wills. Richard's debts gave him leverage. Killing him ensured the estate's administration and his fees would flow unchecked. The misdirections were clever, the footprints to suggest flight, the planted evidence to divide us. Diana shivered. And using my room, my perfume on those gloves, He knew I'd be the obvious suspect, the actress with a past. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, but small details betray. Your shoes wear pattern didn't match the prints, and the poison vial's disturbance pointed to someone with medical access, though that was a feint to implicate Dr. Fenton briefly. Fenton stopped pacing. I suspected Diana myself. Foolish of me. Mrs. Bantry dabbed her eyes, and I kept silent about overhearing the struggle. My investments, Richard's swindle, I thought perhaps justice had been served, but murder! Oh, what a wicked web! The distant rumble grew louder. Engines, voices. Bates peered out. The ploughs, milady, and police cars behind them. They'll be here within the hour. Lady Evelyn straightened. Then let us ensure the truth is clear, Jane. You have pieced it together so masterfully. Tell us once more how the trap was set. Miss Marple nodded modestly. It began with the storm's isolation, which amplified tensions. Richard argued with Carver in the library over the pawn ticket and forgeries. In the scuffle, Carver grabbed the letter opener. Impulse turned deadly. Panicking, he staged the scene, smashed the watch at 11:47 to create a timeline gap, opened the windows for misleading tracks, then used the hidden passage to return unseen. The cloak and shoes, Diana prompted, borrowed from the boot room, Lady Evelyn's cloak for warmth, old shoes close to your size for planting. He circled back during the wind's howl, avoiding detection. Later, he hid the pearls in the attic with a forged note in his own hand. Subtle errors in the loops and tails. The poison glass was added during tea, wrapped in your handkerchief, to suggest you planned a second attempt or suicide frame. And the burning letters last night? Dr. Fenton asked. His own correspondence with shady contacts, destroyed in haste when suspicion turned. Bates cleared his throat. The police will need the body, milady. Shall I prepare? Yes, Evelyn replied softly. And summon the vicar when road's clear. Richard deserves a proper burial, despite everything. As they waited, reflections turned inward. Miss Marple spoke of St. Mary Mead. Murders there are rare, but human nature is constant. A stolen jam recipe once led to blows. Here, fortunes and legacies did the same. We deceive, we covet, but truth outs, like crocuses through snow. Diana smiled faintly. You've been our guiding light, Miss Marple. Unassuming, yet unerring. I merely observe, she replied. People talk, gestures reveal. Your bracelet's fidgeting showed fear, Doctor. Mr. Carver's averted eyes hid guilt. Outside, shouts rang out. Vehicles crunched through the slush. Uniformed officers, bundled against the cold, approached with shovels and questions. Inspector Craddock from the county force led them, a stout man with a kind face, whom Miss Marple recognized from a past case. Miss Marple, what a surprise! We've had reports of trouble here. She smiled. Indeed, Inspector, but the matter is resolved. Mr. Carver will explain, under caution. Of course. Statements were taken amid the thawing chaos. Carver, pale and compliant, confessed fully. The embezzled funds from Mrs. Bantry's investments had funded his scheme. Richard's discovery sealed his doom. The pearls, redeemed secretly by Carver for profit, were recovered from the attic. As the body was removed, Lady Evelyn stood at the door, tears freezing on her cheeks. He was broken by war, Jane. We all were, in ways. Miss Marple patted her arm. Healing comes with time. Perhaps turn the manor to good, your museum idea, for veterans' memory. Evelyn nodded. And you? Back to St. Mary Mead? Soon, but first, a cup of tea. Nothing settles the soul like that. The group shared a simple meal as officials bustled. Bonds formed and adversity lingered. Diana promised to stay with Evelyn. Fenton vowed better vigilance over his affections. Mrs. Bantry pledged honest charity henceforth. By afternoon, roads cleared enough for departure. Miss Marple boarded a waiting car with Inspector Craddock, her suitcase and knitting bag in tow. As the manor receded in the rear view, blanketed in melting snow, she reflected on the web of human frailty. The snowstorm had trapped not just bodies, but secrets, now released into the dawn. In St. Mary Mead, life would resume, church meetings, garden talks, quiet observations. But Miss Marple carried a new scarf, woven from the threads of this ordeal, a reminder that even in grand houses, village wisdom prevails. The trap had sprung, but dawn brought freedom.